Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 416. This week the questions are taken from guides 492 and 493 on the USS Enterprise of 1799 and HMS Rodney of 1884, together with the Wednesday videos on naval ideas that didn't quite work and merchant vessels at war, plus the Friday video on ship prefixes. Patalong asks, at the beginning of your Jutland video, you mentioned several missed opportunities for luring the British battlecruiser fleet into a trap, as well as engagements which gave the High Seas Fleet some ammunition handling lessons. Could you please describe those in a bit more detail? The primary engagement which gave the High Seas Fleet a short, sharp lesson in ammunition handling was the Battle of Dogger Bank, which was where they lost the armoured cruiser Blücher, but the particular ship that taught them a lot about ammunition handling was Seydlitz, because she took a 13.5-inch shell hit to one of her aft barbettes, and that caused a fire in the working room, which is, on some ships, a small chamber immediately below the main gunhouse chamber, where ammunition and charges are essentially taken off the main hoist and put onto smaller secondary hoists to go up to the guns. In any case, that started a fire there, and because there were ready-use charges in the turret system and in the hoists and so forth, it led to a very catastrophic fire that actually ended up burning out both aft turrets, and they were very lucky not to lose Seydlitz to a magazine explosion, basically exactly the same thing that would doom at least two of the British battlecruisers at Jutland. And so the Germans took a look at the burnt out aft of Seydlitz, realised just how close they'd come to having the whole thing explode on them, and went, maybe we should not do that in the future. In terms of engagements where the Germans missed the opportunity to lure the battlecruisers into a trap, the biggest one that most people usually cite is the raid on Scarborough and the nearby towns of Hartlepool and Whitby, because at that point you had the British battlecruisers plus about a single dreadnought battle squadron out, and the Germans had their first scouting group out and the entire High Seas Fleet out to back them up. But through various shenanigans, they ended up not engaging and withdrawing, which was a huge missed opportunity because that was basically the perfect engagement the Germans had been hoping for. But there were other engagements as well. Very early in the war, there was the first Battle of Heligoland Bight right off the German coast, essentially. And although the timing of the battle was somewhat fortuitous to the British in that it started while the tide was too low for the big German ships of the High Seas Fleet to get out and engage, the British forces hung around for several hours after the tide had risen to a point where the German heavy ships could get out, but for various reasons they didn't, or they didn't in good time, and the British had plenty of time to withdraw before the first big German ship showed up on the scene. There was also a raid on Yarmouth, where the Germans had actually sent out 2 squadrons of dreadnoughts to try and destroy any British response that was sent out. But through, again, various shenanigans, which is a phrase that you'll find quite a lot with a lot of early World War I engagements, Hipper shot up Yarmouth for a bit, went back again, and essentially the British didn't show up in time. And so, although they had a perfect opportunity, the Germans were actually a little bit too quick on the withdrawal, and thus Beatty couldn't be lured onto the German dreadnought squadrons when he didn't even show up in time to chase the German battlecruisers. And then there was a similar raid on Lowestoft, which, again, basically the British didn't respond quite as quickly as they ideally wanted to, but the Germans also withdrew slightly faster than they probably should have done. If the first scout group had hung around for a little bit longer, they would have run into the battlecruiser fleet, and they would have then been able to draw them onto the High Seas Fleet, which was out and waiting for exactly that opportunity. So essentially a lot of it came down to a case of jittery nerves and on the Germans' part, and a slightly lackadaisical response by the British. The Carthaginian asks, I'll be returning to Kure, Hiroshima and Yokosuka, or Yokosuka possibly, in the summer 27. I was wondering if you could pass on in a dry dock the names and addresses of some of the shops where you found good sources, English or Japanese, for books on the Imperial Japanese Navy. Unfortunately, I'd have to say email me, because, obviously, unfortunately, I don't speak Japanese, so I did find a number of decent bookshops, but I found them by a mixture of using Google Translate and local recommendations, and then visually matching, oh, this is what the picture of the bookshop looks like. This is clearly the bookshop. And then doing my level best to apologise to the poor bookshop owners who generally didn't speak all that much English. But I did find still a good number of books which were very useful and have been very useful since. So probably best, as I said, would be drop me an email or a message on Discord, and then I can send you Google Maps locations and things like that and explain exactly how to find them and where. Samoilenko asks, what are the main reasons we never saw submersible armoured or aircraft carrying warships, like more developed versions of the I-400s or the Surcoufs? Was it because naval treaties limited displacement and performance of subs, or maybe large submersible vessels are just too expensive or inefficient for what they provide compared to their capabilities? Or is it just impossible to combine armour, heavy guns, or aircraft with submersible capabilities at that point in history? Mostly for gun-based subs, it was the treaties. There were quite a lot of designs for submarines with varying degrees of heavy guns, whether they be 5, 5.5, 6 or 8-inch, and of course the M's with 12-inch guns. And some of them were of considerable size and considerable advancement. So this is a US design, as you can see, armed with 8 8-inch guns and 4 twin turrets plus armour. And that wasn't even the first design for an armoured submarine armed with guns. The Germans had sketched out a few versions that they wanted to see about building in the First World War, but never quite got round to. The main problem was the sheer size and cost of these things. I mean, you can probably see from the legend here, this thing is 13,500 tons. So we're talking about a submarine that is going to displace as much as a medium-sized armoured cruiser or a small to mid-size pre-dreadnought, only, a decade or so after those ships have been made obsolete, and it's displacing considerably more than the more recent cruisers. And so, as you can imagine, with that amount of expense that would be necessary, yes, they might experiment with 1 or 2 of those in the interwar period, except for the fact that you don't jump into building a submarine this size without some incremental steps, and those incremental steps would be things like X1 and so forth. But then that was rapidly curtailed by general restrictions on submarines in the first treaty, the Washington Naval Treaty, and then very specific restrictions on large submarines in the London Naval Treaty, because it was all very well, saying, okay, yeah, technically under the Washington Treaty we could probably build something like this, but it would take up so much of your submarine tonnage, as opposed to building, 6, 8, 10, 12 smaller subs, that you might not want to do it. And then, of course, say along came the London Treaty and just said, you just can't do this anymore. So, despite the fact that heavy gun-based submarines probably wouldn't have worked too brilliantly, especially in this kind of role where they're clearly designed to be battle line units as opposed to commerce raiders, you could, without the treaties, theoretically have seen some of them been built. At least for experimental purposes, if nothing else. But when it comes to carrier submarines, aircraft carrier submarines, it's a lot more difficult because, of course, with an aircraft carrier, to have any kind of practical air group, you need a very large open space inside the ship for the hangar. And then you also need a very large flight deck to accommodate air operations. The minimum size that you need to accomplish that with even a handful of aircraft, even a dozen, is considerable. And of course, submarines aren't really the best kind of vessels to have slab sides and a flat flight deck atop them, for diving purposes. It doesn't lend itself well to the shape of a pressure hull, for instance. So even if you could make a submersible vessel with a socking great box hangar stuck on top of it, it's not going to be able to submerge very far underwater with that kind of shape. And you'd have huge issues with any kind of aircraft lift and being able to keep a watertight seal on it. The only other option would be something like an I-400, where you have compacted down aircraft in essentially a secondary pressure hull, but then you have to take them out, assemble them and launch them. And that massively cuts down on the number of aircraft that you can carry, the type of aircraft you can carry, and how you launch them, which means that you're only ever going to be able to launch very small numbers of aircraft with a very small payload, and it's going to take forever to do. So yeah, unfortunately, with the technology of the interwar period in World War II, a submarine carrier just basically isn't possible unless you're talking about essentially a semi-submersible carrier, a small one even then, but one that basically can only go down like 50 feet or so, just enough to submerge the flight deck. Tem7007 asks, "Hey Drac, everyone knows about Japanese kamikazes and how their navy had quite the unique culture for disregarding the lives of their servicemen or finding it honourable to die in battle. I was wondering, though, what practices did the other navies of World War II, or perhaps before then, have which put their people at nearly as much risk as kamikaze pilots found themselves in?" Outside of kamikaze units, the single highest casualty branch of pretty much any navy in World War I or World War II was the submarine branch. And you tend to find that regardless of what navy you're looking at. It's just the sheer magnitude of the losses obviously is somewhat higher for something like the Japanese Navy's submarine arm or the U-boat arm. But nonetheless, it is still a very high casualty count. And that's partly because, obviously, if a ship is sunk, unless it's a catastrophic event like a magazine explosion, generally speaking, it takes a while for the ship to sink, and the ship starts on the surface, which means that anyone who survived the explosions that caused the ship to be in a sinking condition in the first place has a reasonable chance, unless they're trapped or something, of getting off of the ship. And thus, while there might be lots of casualties, there will also tend to be quite a few survivors, again, assuming you're not doing something like having to jump off into the Arctic Ocean. Whereas with a submarine, normally, when a submarine is sunk, it tends to get sunk underwater, and there's not really any escaping that, except for extremely rare circumstances where a submarine might be sunk in extremely shallow water, and then survivors can try and use an escape trunk. But normally, submarines have a distressing habit of going down with all hands. You do have occasional cases where submarines manage to make it to the surface and either surrender, or they make it to the surface and a decent number of the crew are able to make it out before the submarine slips back beneath the waves. But those tend to be the exception rather than the rule. And of course, submarines also have a couple of other disadvantages in that they're using their stealth to get into areas where there's a very heavy enemy presence and there's not many of them, and they're not really able to fight back all that much compared to a surface warship. And ultimately, especially with the technology of most World War I and World War II subs, if your submarine is detected and is being pursued, you have to rely purely on skill with a healthy dose of luck to escape, because you will not be able to outrun your pursuers. You have to try and outthink them. And as I said, even then you need a phenomenal dose of luck, because you might outthink one of the escorts or aircraft that's chasing you, but if you don't know that there's another one out there, you don't know to outthink it. Or, the enemy might just guess lucky. And since they generally have the speed advantage, even if they guess unluckily the first time, as long as they still know roughly where you are, they can keep guessing and guessing and guessing until either your luck runs out, or your battery runs out, or your oxygen runs out, or some combination of thereof. And while submarines do remain a threat towards the end of something like especially World War II, especially for something like the Kriegsmarine U-boat arm, it was getting a little bit kamikaze-like, and for the Japanese as well, because essentially what was happening is the vast majority of Axis submarine crews by the end of the war were very young and inexperienced, because most of the older and experienced ones had already been destroyed and sunk. And that meant you sent out young, relatively inexperienced crews against veteran submarine hunters with increasing levels of anti-submarine technology, which meant those crews got sunk even faster, and thus you ended up cycling younger and younger and younger crews with less and less experience, which made them easy to sink, and so on and so on. Of course, there were some veteran crews still around, but even they were really up against it by the end of the war, with the disparity between the average Axis submarine and 1944-45 era Allied anti-submarine technology and numbers. You did, of course, have a few new things coming along, like the electro boats, but those were few and far between, and even that technological advantage very often could be mitigated by the sheer experience and numbers of Allied anti-submarine assets. And at the beginning of World War I, speaking of submarines, but going back to surface ships, there were a few times when various ships were sent into circumstances on both sides, but particularly notably something like the British with the patrol of Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy, where people just didn't understand, or at least some of the people in charge didn't fully understand, the implications of some of the new forms of warfare like submarine warfare, and quite a number of ships just blundered into situations which got them all sunk because, well, they didn't necessarily know any better. Almirante Brown asks, in the NavWeps entry for the 13.5-inch 45 caliber gun states that the Admiralty had asked Vickers in October 1908 to quote for new designs for 13-inch, 13.5-inch and 14-inch guns. Do you have any information about the conceptual 13-inch gun design, including its length and caliber, the weight of the gun, the shells, etc., etc.? And did the Admiralty give any serious thought to picking the 13-inch design before they selected the 13.5-inch? If Britain had gone with a 13-inch gun for its early super dreadnoughts, how would that have influenced the selection of its successor? Would we still have gone with a 15-inch 42? Unfortunately, I don't have a huge amount of information about the conceptual 13-inch gun design because, as you probably already know, the request for design options for the different guns was made only 2 and a bit months, I think 2.5, 3 months before the selection for the 13.5-inch as the future Royal Navy battleship gun was made. So in that time, given that you've got to get the work out to the designers, they've got to sketch up designs, make calculations, etc., there's nowhere near enough time to manufacture prototypes or really come up with anything outside of the most basic ideas of how it's going to work. And looking at the relative weights of different shells for different guns in that kind of 12, 13, 13.5, 14-inch size range, given that the Navy wanted this at least the same kind of performance in terms of shell speed at range as the higher velocity 12-inch 50, which wasn't really working out that well, and thus obviously you'd have more penetration because the bigger shell would have more mass to it, thus the kinetic energy is half mv squared equation would favour it. Anyway, it just really wouldn't have worked very well with the 13-inch gun, because the 13-inch gun would have had a shell weight of probably between 1,000 and 1,100 pounds, which wouldn't have been much, maybe a 20 to 25% improvement over the shell weight of the 12-inch gun, but the gun weight and thus the weight of the overall armament would have increased quite significantly. So you would have had to sacrifice a certain number of gun barrels unless you massively expanded the ship, and your overall broadside weight wouldn't go up that much. The overall penetration power wouldn't go up that much, as compared to the 13.5-inch, which offers with the heavier shell at least, offers something in the order of about a 65-66% increase in shell weight, and thus commensurately considerably more penetrating power, more explosive delivered onto target, etc., etc. And so that's why it makes the more obvious choice, and obviously the 14-inch still more so, but the 14-inch gun involves considerably more weight, even though it's only half an inch larger than the 13.5, and the increase in overall system weight versus the marginal increase in penetration versus the 13.5 is what drove the Navy to select the 13.5. Therefore, I don't think they would have really given much serious thought to selecting the 13-inch gun once they saw the overall increase in weight and expense of the armament versus the relatively minimal increase in performance relative to the 12-inch gun. If, however, they had gone for the 13-inch gun for whatever reason, in the Orions at least, let's say, I think you probably still would have got the 15-inch 42, or at least a 15-inch gun. Because of all the downsides I just mentioned, there would have been a drive to make sure that the next jump in gun caliber was actually enough to give you a significant increase in penetration, range, and overall broadside weight. And so, although going from a 13 to a 15 compared to a 13.5 to a 15 is another half-inch caliber jump, they probably would have gone for that purely out of a desire to make sure that they actually got what they wanted this time round. Firefox60 asks, high explosive, fragmentation, semi-armor piercing, etc. What sort and ratio of rounds would a warship carry? Would destroyers carry mostly high explosive? Would battleships carry mostly armor piercing ballistic capped rounds, etc., etc.? As a general rule of thumb, the smaller the ship, the more high explosive rounds it would carry, and in some cases, with small ships armed with particularly small guns, there may not be an armor-piercing round. If you're lucky, there'll be a semi-armor-piercing round, but sometimes there might not even be that, if you're talking about the really small stuff. And, of course, when you get into something like World War II, you also have to factor in anti-aircraft shells, which sometimes could just be high-explosive rounds, but there were also dedicated anti-aircraft shells with a lot more shrapnel capacity. But as you went up guns in size order, you'd start to see a lot more semi-armor piercing or armor piercing rounds and see them carried in significantly greater numbers. But there were variations to this. So, for example, the ships of 7th Fleet in World War II that went to bombard various land targets, so this is the older battleships of the US Navy, they carried a disproportionately large number of high explosive rounds compared to armor piercing rounds because they were mostly expecting to do shore bombardment, and their armor piercing shell capacity was essentially just enough to see them through a brief engagement with a heavy surface unit if they happened to encounter one. Similarly, a lot of the ships that were doing bombardment duty on D-Day were expecting to fling an awful lot of high explosive at the enemy, not a huge amount of armor piercing, and therefore their magazines were artificially weighted towards the high explosive. Whereas obviously when ships go out more generally expecting to see perhaps surface action, you'll see a much higher ratio of, at least in battleships and cruisers, of armor piercing or semi-armor piercing in some cruiser cases rounds compared to high explosive. And for smaller guns, particularly dual-purpose guns, you also have quite a wide variety of other shell types, even though they might only be carried in small numbers. And even for like cruiser guns, like say the 6-inch guns on Belfast, even though they're not anti-aircraft capable and therefore they won't carry anti-aircraft rounds the way that a 4 or 5-inch gun would, you still have illumination rounds at that scale. So you'll also have smoke rounds sometimes, and of course everyone has a small number of training rounds. Josh Thomas Moore asks, are there any naval ideas that were abandoned because they didn't work at the time, but might have worked later, but were then never followed up, at least during the period that the channel covers? There were quite a few, actually. One idea was the wire-guided torpedo. So in the very late 1800s and very early 1900s, especially for shore-based installations, there was quite the craze for wire-guided torpedoes, i.e. you have a wire spooling out behind the torpedo and then the torpedo could be guided from a shore station. How exactly you spot where the torpedo is going, well, that varied quite a bit from torpedo type to torpedo type, but the general principle was there. Essentially, the two problems with speed, making sure the torpedo travelled slow enough to not just snap its wires, and this whole problem of working out where exactly the torpedo is to guide it in properly, meant that wire-guided shore-based torpedo installations generally started to fall by the wayside, even by the late 1900s. And certainly in World War I and World War II, while there are a handful of old obsolete stations around, they weren't really frontline weapons anymore. And then, once you get into World War II, torpedoes are being either fired off completely unguided, so you just point using your fire control system and fire them and hope that the target is somewhere along that straight line path, or towards the very end of the time period the channel covers, you have homing torpedoes, but they're homing on their own. Whereas, of course, these days, most anti-submarine and anti-ship torpedoes, and well, almost any torpedo that's fired these days, except for maybe stuff that's dropped from helicopters, will tend to have wire guidance, at least for its initial part of its run, and then the wires will be cut to allow it to home in with its sonar or whatever other systems they're using. Another system that was tested and then abandoned in the time period the channel works was the anti-aircraft rocket. Things like the UP rocket launchers, the Japanese had a go as well. A few other navies experimented with it as well. But essentially they were abandoned for just not being accurate enough and being far too much trouble. But of course, the anti-aircraft rocket would come back immediately post the time period that the channel looks at in the form of the naval surface-to-air missile. Basically, once they worked out how to strap some kind of guidance system to the thing. Of course, towards the very end of the time period the channel covers, there were also early attempts at air-to-air missiles and surface-to-air missiles on land. But in terms of mounting a surface-to-air rocket or surface-to-air missile, whatever you want to call it, on a ship, it just about post-dates the time period the channel covers, after them having been tested and mostly abandoned by most people, except for the Japanese, at the beginning of the Second World War. Random Warehouse asks, you've mentioned the feasibility of a German cruiser carrier for commerce raiding. So what other unconventional options for asymmetrical combat or commerce raiding could work in this context? Perhaps long-range destroyers or large torpedo boats, sort of in the capability range of a submarine, but less survivable, but could be built more quickly and passed off pre-war as coastal defence vessels. Perhaps an increase in long-range aviation with more investment put into smart bombs earlier. Possibly even Deutschland-class variants with 15-inch guns to pose at least a nominal threat to a battleship, or other heavily escorted convoys, or maybe swarming attack with linked fire control systems, similar to how the Russians countered Yavut Sultan Selim in the Black Sea. Well, I think part of the issue is that when you look at unconventional options, there are counters to them. So it's not that the measures I'm about to suggest would work during the entire war. There would be ways to stop them, but they would perhaps work at certain periods in the war, particularly in the early part of the war. So I think with that, certainly long-range aviation would be a major factor, because prior to the advent of escort carriers and air bases in Iceland and so forth, even the relatively small force of FW-200s that were operated were a major problem. Now, obviously, they're mainly doing recon, but when they attacked, for the first few years, escorts had, or escorted convoys had very little in the way of anti-aircraft defense. And, think something like, say, a Flower-class corvette had a minimal amount of anti-air self-defense, but wasn't really in any way, shape, or form able to defend other ships in a convoy. And even with things like catapult armed merchantmen, you've got one shot because you fire off the aircraft and it either succeeds or it doesn't. And if the strike aircraft, the long-range strike aircraft that's from the Germans, are smart, they'll see the launch, they'll withdraw, and then either come back once that fighter has run out of fuel, or they'll mark the convoy and go, hey, well, these guys had a catapult armed merchantman, they've fired off their aircraft, so maybe we don't have enough fuel to hang around long enough, but if there's a fair number of them, they can just radio in someone else and say, hey, there'll be a convoy that can't defend itself from air attack now, go and have fun. And again, there are counters to this. Eventually escort carriers will come along. You could start developing and putting into place dedicated anti-aircraft escort ships considerably sooner than they historically were. But that all requires diversion of resources and will take time. So early on, it will be very effective. And it will also have the secondary effect of increasing the capabilities of enemy submarines, that being the U-boats, because obviously more long-range aircraft out there means more reports, which means more data they can act on. And if Allied attention is split between either building anti-aircraft escorts and anti-submarine escorts, or building some kind of larger escort that has both anti-submarine and anti-air capabilities, that cuts down on the number of dedicated anti-submarine hulls available, which means the U-boats become more effective. I don't think long-range destroyers or large torpedo boats would work particularly well, simply because a few decent fleet destroyers or even a single light cruiser would make mincemeat of them. They're too easy to counter. Deutschland variants with twin 15-inch guns, or mini Courageouses, I guess, at that point, I think they're too expensive to build, and you wouldn't get that many of them, and therefore they would, relatively speaking, easily be taken out because they become priority targets, and the resources you'd be putting into them, you'd be better put into almost anything else. Another option that might, bizarrely enough, work as part of a wolf pack might be a fast mine-laying sub. So design it for fairly high speed on the surface, fill it full of mines, and then essentially adopt a tactic that's a variation on what some Wolfpack submarines actually did do, which would be to position yourself ahead of the convoy, and then in the case of normal torpedo armed submarines, what they do is position themselves ahead, submerge, let the convoy pass over them, pop up, fire some torpedoes, drop back down again, and essentially drift after the convoy, then run around ahead of them at night on the surface and repeat. But with a mine-laying sub, what you do is drop off a bunch of mines instead. So you position yourself ahead of the convoy at night, drop off a bunch of mines ahead of them, possibly even chain-linked mines, and then submerge. And you still have some torpedoes, but the main thing will be submerge and then move away. Maybe you only deploy half your mines this time round. And the idea would then be that if the convoy then shortly thereafter runs into your mines, then they're going to think that they're under attack by torpedoes, perhaps. So they're going to panic, wondering where they're coming from. That might break the convoy up. Or if they realize that they've hit mines, they're going to have to, again, probably break formation or start maneuvering. But in any case, it's going to cause a lot of confusion and potential breakup of the formation, which other torpedo-armed submarines of the Wolfpack might then be able to exploit considerably more than the Wolfpack making an attack on a convoy that is still in formation with its escorts armed and alert. Sharkman asks, in the era of steam and steel, did cruisers ever actually do their intended role of merchant interdiction? World War I and II seemed dominated by submarines as the primary commerce raiders, but were there any other wars in which shells from big guns regularly fell on convoys or merchants? Well, you've got to remember, in the age of steam and steel, the reintroduction of convoys in a big way really only happens when you get to World War I and the late part of World War I at that. There are various cruisers that go on merchant hunting sprees in the early period of steam and steel. So we're talking Spanish-American War, Russo-Japanese War, etc., etc., those kind of conflicts. There is a limited amount of enemy merchant shipping being seized. But one of the bigger issues in those particular conflicts is, of course, that the vast majority of the world shipping, literally, I think something like 60%, maybe a bit more than that, of the world shipping flies the red ensign at that point. So it's British. So literally everybody else has to fit into the other lower percentage. And so although there are a few largish merchant fleets, neither the American nor the Spanish nor the Japanese nor the Russian merchant fleets were particularly large. And relative to the really big navies of that period, neither were any of the navies that were involved particularly large, at least when they came to the Russians, because they were split up. Like collectively, there were a lot of Russian ships, but they just weren't in a lot of places. And so there was a small amount of cruiser warfare, but there's a relatively small number of cruisers and a relatively small number of targets spread amongst a whole bunch of other ships who you definitely don't want to target, because then you bring down the wrath of the Royal Navy on you. So you only really get a chance to fully try and see cruiser warfare kick off when there's a lot of targets to go after, and that basically means the two world wars. There is a reasonable degree of cruiser merchant interdiction in the First World War. So you've got the Northern Patrol Line, the Northern Blockade, the blockade of the North Sea, whatever you want to call it, which is done by Royal Navy cruisers and armed merchant cruisers, and they are regularly seizing enemy merchant ships, because the German merchant marine is one of the larger ones at this point. And certainly in the early stages of World War I, there is quite a lot of widespread cruiser activity by the Royal Navy picking off various German merchant ships across the world. It's one of the things that somewhat annoys the later to be Admiral King, when at the beginning of the First World War, he takes his ship out into the US Atlantic seaboard, and he's slightly annoyed by the fact there's a bunch of Royal Navy cruisers proudly flying the white ensign, patrolling up and down just outside American territorial waters, going after German shipping. He thinks that this is a bit of an affront to American sovereignty, even though they're technically within their rights to do so. So obviously cruiser warfare is going on, and it will go on to a limited degree throughout the rest of World War I, because there are a few hostile German, or basically mostly German, merchant ships still out there, so they're patrolling to catch them as well as going after the occasional raider. And you see the same thing, but on a slightly scaled down level in the Second World War. So there still is a kind of a North Sea blockade to stop German ships getting home. That's why Altmark tries to sneak through the Norwegian territorial waters. And there are various operations around and about going after German merchant ships and then Italian merchant ships and so forth in the Atlantic, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, etc. But it's on a somewhat smaller scale than World War One, partly because the Royal Navy has fewer ships and the ones that they have are needed in more frontline duties a lot of the time, and partly because also, frankly, the German and Italian merchant fleets in World War II are considerably smaller than the German merchant fleet was in World War One. But it still is somewhat of a thing, although obviously there aren't really convoys of any great scale for the Royal Navy to attack. Once you get, but then obviously the flip side, obviously there in both World Wars, there's a lot of British and then later Allied shipping, and well, the Germans do try cruiser warfare in both cases. It doesn't really work out massively spectacularly well, and so they go over to using U-boats. Long Johnson asks, the discussion on prefixes sparked many questions. Could you perhaps discuss civilian prefixes and the ship letters that are used in general ship prefixes? I was most curious of all when you said not all naval vessels were ships. Could you expand on that, given that at least one member of your audience thought until very recently that boat and ship were synonyms? So with the boat-ship designation, there's a lot of competing arguments as to what makes a boat, what makes a ship. Like one of them is, you know, when you put it in a turn, if it leans into the turn, it's a boat. If it leans out of the turn, it's a ship, and various other ways of looking at it. The way I generally prefer to look at it as a simple rule of thumb, and of course people may disagree, is if we are talking about a rigid-hulled vessel, so, you know, discarding inflatables and collapsibles for the minute, but if we're talking about a rigid-hulled vessel that carries at least one other rigid-hulled vessel aboard, then it is a ship. If it doesn't carry any other vessels on board it, or if it does it, they're inflatable, collapsible, that kind of thing, then it is a boat. So by that definition, obviously most naval vessels are ships, but something like a submarine is typically known as a boat because a submarine doesn't carry, you know, a wooden or steel ship's boat aboard. In most cases, obviously there's a few that are carrying landing craft for specialist missions and so forth, but, you know, broadly speaking, the only kind of other vessel that a submarine in standard service is going to be launching will be something like a Carly float or a collapsible dinghy or something, and therefore those don't count. So as a rigid-hull vessel that isn't carrying any other rigid-hulled vessel, it is a boat, even though obviously submarines can be quite considerable size. And then, of course, technically things like Macon and Akron in the US Navy and various other airships in other navies, they are naval vessels. They're not technically either ships or boats. I mean, they're airships, theoretically, but they are not ships or boats by standard definitions. And then if you get much further back in time, really before hull designations are a thing, but at a time when prefixes definitely are a thing, back then, in the Age of Sail, the term ship actually had an even more specific meaning, which was essentially that a ship was a large vessel with at least 3 masts, and each of those masts had to have at least one square-rigged sail on them. Now, that last bit, you know, having at least one square-rigged sail, that was a little bit negotiable at times, because you could get a large vessel that had, say, 2 square-rigged masts, and the mizzen mast was, say, lateen-rigged. And technically, by the very, very strict definition, that wasn't a ship, but most people would call it a ship. But the kind of the general rule of thumb was, is it a big vessel with at least 3 masts? Okay, great, it is a ship. But that meant you could have a brig or a sloop or a schooner or anything like that, and that could be a naval vessel, an unrated naval vessel most usually. But if it only had 2 masts, it could not be a ship by Age of Sail definitions, even though, you know, if you saw it today, you might say, oh, yeah, of course, that's clearly a small naval ship. Well, actually, no, it's a brig. But then obviously when masts go away, that whole form of defining what isn't a ship also goes by the wayside. When it comes to civilian prefixes, though, there's a lot more prefixes nowadays than there used to be in the time period the channel covers. In the time period the channel covers, most of the time, you will find occasionally people being pedantic and going through all sorts of little fancy prefixes, but most of the merchant ship designations that you'll find tend to revolve around their method of propulsion. So the vast majority will either be SS something, which, depending on who you ask, either means screw ship or steamship, but essentially it's a shorthand, regardless of what the technicalities are. It's a shorthand for steamship, i.e. there are boilers in there and they run on coal or they run on oil, but they're generating steam and that is what's making the vessel go. The other major one is MV. Sometimes they use MS, but it means motor vessel or motor ship, and that's used in the early 20th century to denote diesel-powered vessels. And that's basically the vast majority of civilian ship prefixes that you'll encounter in the time period the channel covers. Go back to the age of sail, most civilian ships just won't have a prefix, period. And when you get into the age of steam, well, obviously most ships are using steam power, so they'll get SS. You'll occasionally see in the early 1840s, 50s, 60s, you'll see some people using PS for paddle ship to distinguish it from a screw ship. But again, it's a fairly niche. The only other major prefix that you'll tend to come across for civilian stuff is RMS, and occasionally approximate equivalents for other nations, but they're quite rare. I mean, RMS is relatively rare as well, but RMS means Royal Mail Ship or Royal Mail Steamer, and that's, well, as the name suggests, it has a charter from the Royal Mail to carry mail, because back then, in the time period the channel covers, that was the quickest and most reliable way of getting post across the world. But certainly in the 20th century, RMS also tended to carry a few other definitions, because Royal Mail ships, because they wanted large carry volume and reliability, they tended to be the higher quality, higher end vessels. And as a result, the government usually ended up with programs like subsidizing RMS ships to have pre-sighted strengthening points for deck guns so that they could make them into auxiliary cruisers fairly quickly in the event of war, which they actually did. There's a whole bunch of smaller, prefixes for things like yachts and fishing ships and so forth, but they tend not to be as widely used, even if they are technically applicable. The Outer Circle asks, I was looking at a few designs where they mixed screw types based on the shaft driving it and the position on the axis of the ship, such as with Titanic having a central 4-bladed screw versus the 3-bladed screws on either side. I would imagine different screws had different RPMs, could cause cavitation within the water or could interfere with the wash of each other. Could you shed some light on the development of the screw propeller and when they began to introduce variable pitch to counteract these forces? So screw propellers started to be introduced in the 1830s and 1840s, which is when the very, very earliest practical ones were deployed. Variable pitch propellers actually come in relatively quickly after that. The first variable pitch screw propellers are actually introduced in the 1840s, barely a handful of years after screw propellers themselves have been introduced. But the problem is, given the amount of force that's exerted on a propeller throughout most of the 19th century, coming up with a way of transmitting enough force to the propeller to change the pitch on its blades and hold them in place against the forces being exerted on them, while maintaining, the correct alignment of the blades and everything, it's very difficult. So there are some variable pitch propellers in the late 19th century, but really not that many. And a lot of the ones that are, you tend to have to stop the propeller, lock it to a new pitch setting, and then get it spinning up again. The number that you can actually change the pitch on the fly while it's spinning, very small. And you only really see true variable pitch propellers the way we would understand them today coming in the interwar period, when quite significant breakthroughs are made in metallurgy and motors and all sorts of other things like this. So, and the main reason for variable pitch propellers isn't so much to offset the effects of other propellers, it's more to allow variation in the amount of thrust, the efficiency, and the type of thrust that you're generating at a given RPM without having to change the RPM. Because remember, much as turbines have an optimal rotational speed for efficient usage, there's also sweet spots in terms of just how fast you thrash the propellers through the water. So if you want a bit more thrust, then it can sometimes be more beneficial just to tweak the pitch of your propeller to give you more thrust at a given RPM rather than change up the RPM. And then when you have ships like you can see here with the battleship Missouri, with, in this case, 5-bladed propellers on the inside and 4-bladed on the outside, this can be for a wide variety of reasons. Sometimes it is because you have a desire to have, say, the outer shafts doing cruising and the inner shafts doing high speed, and there can be different propeller arrangements that are more optimal for each of those configurations. Sometimes it can be for vibration issues, like you have on the North Carolinas, and sometimes it can also be to do with the amount of clearance you have between the propeller shaft and the hull. And at that point, you might, if you've got particularly confined space, you might want a greater number of blades, because with a greater number of smaller blades, you can have roughly the same amount of surface area as a fewer bladed, much larger propeller that you can put on a part of the ship where perhaps the propeller shaft can be further away from the hull. So there's lots of different reasons why you might have different numbers of blades on your propellers, but they're not necessarily going to generate interfering features in the water or even different levels of thrust, because you can tweak the RPM on the different props to generate the same level of thrust, or, as I said, because you get different efficiencies with different numbers and types of blades, you might end up with, okay, we've got in this case a 4-bladed prop on the outer shaft, and let's say at 200 RPM it produces a certain amount of thrust, but you could configure the inner props to also deliver the same amount of thrust at 200 RPM. You just change the size and number of blades until the surface area and their pitch is generating exactly, is essentially chucking the same amount of water backwards. That might not necessarily be the optimal solution, but you can do that. And then, of course, obviously with variable pitch, you can tweak things even further. Brucey Antica asks, during the late age of sail, to what degree are a ship's dimensions or scantlings and the largest cannons and carronades you could mount on a ship related? And in your estimation, what would be the size difference between a ship of the line that could mount an all 68-pounder carronade armament versus a ship of the line that could mount an all 68-pounder cannon, i.e. 95 CWT gun, armament? Well, there's not really a huge relation between dimensions and scantlings compared to carronades that you can mount, because even a big carronade, like a 64-pounder carronade, that only weighs marginally more than a 12-pounder long gun. So on anything that's worthy of being called a rated warship, you can basically swap out 64-pounder carronades for basically any and every gun that they carry. And even in the case of rated warship that might have, say, a 9-pounder in chase, the overall savings in weight you'll make generally will still allow you to have a few heavy carronades there, even if on a small 6th rate you maybe want to go down to 32-pounders, because then you'll be saving a huge amount of weight. Then you can have a 64-pounder chase carronade. If you want to carry cannon as opposed to carronades, then yes, at that point dimensions and scantlings make a lot more difference, because the other thing is with carronades, because they shoot with considerably less force, and a lot of them, not all, because some of them are on wheel carriages like this one, but a lot of them also use friction to help slow them down once they've fired, the actual strength of a ship isn't so relevant when it comes to firing carronades, because remember, ultimately carronades were supposed to be fired initially from merchant ships, so they're specifically designed to be fired from ships that really don't have all that much in the way of strong hulls the way that a warship would do. So with that said, a ship of the line that could mount an all 68-pounder carronade armament is basically any ship of the line. Any ship of the line that's carrying either 24 or 32-pounders in its lower gun deck, though that armament weight is going to be massively in excess of replacing them with 64-pounder carronades, and you'd save so much weight that replacing the second or upper gun deck as well I mean, you're still probably going to be saving weight. And even if you maybe add a little bit of weight on the absolute upper gun deck, the amount of weight you've saved below, you'll be perfectly fine. So say Victory with 32, 24 and 12 pounders, or 32, 24 and 18 pounders, depending on the time period that she's in service. But let's say 12 pounders. If you replace the lower two gun decks, the 24 and the 32 pounder gun decks, with 64 pounder carronades, you'll have saved quite a considerable amount of weight. At which point the fact that replacing the 12 pounders on the upper gun deck with 64 pounder carronades is technically going to make the ship weigh a bit more, or make that gun deck weigh a bit more, isn't going to really make much odds, because overall you're still saving a huge amount of weight. And that would apply, as I say, to any ship that's got at least a 24 or 32 pounder lower gun deck. The 68 pounder cannon, on the other hand, well, that thing weighs 60% more than a 32 pounder long gun. So, yeah, if you want a ship of the line that can mount all 68 pounders, I don't think there is one that was ever built where you could just go, okay, we're swapping every gun out with a 68 pounder. There are some ships at the late end of the age of sail, or when ships of the line are still a relevant thing, that have extensive 68 pounder batteries, but when you look at them, they do that by sacrificing numbers. So let's say, for sake of argument, you have a really big ship of the line that has 40 gun ports on its lower gun deck, so 20 on each side for 32 pounders. If it's converting that lower gun deck to a 68 pounder, you might find maybe a dozen, 14, 16 such guns, depending on the strength of the ship. But you won't have the same number of 68 pounders as you had 32s. And obviously the weight difference gets more and more as you go further up in the ship, whether it's older school ships along with 24s and 12s and 18s, or whether it's the late stage ones where they just have shorter and shorter variants of the 32 pounder. The weight difference is still going to be a bit more considerable. So given that once you get ships that tend to have an all 68 pounder armament, they tend to be single deck ironclads, as Warrior was originally planned to be, for example. Yeah, I don't think any realistic ship of the line is going to be able to mount an all 68 pounder armament unless it's, a 3-decker but is now just carrying, say, 60 guns or something like that rather than 120 or so. Dave Collier asks, after HMS Hood stripped a turbine chasing Strasbourg, how did they replace it? I've dealt with steam turbines a bit in my career, and they're not something you can just cut to small pieces and bolt back together again on site, nor do the tight tolerances lend themselves to just banging everything back into place. Well, it's all a little bit of an interesting question, because there are even actually, bizarrely enough, sources from the Axis who confirmed that something happened. Particularly, there's an Italian source, an Italian spy in Gibraltar, who immediately after the Moselle Kabir incident reported that he had solid information that, as a result of issues with Hood's turbine, or one of her turbines, that she was limited in speed immediately after coming back from the chase with Strasbourg. But as you say, the turbines are not exactly things that take themselves well to turbines being stripped. However, you do have to remember that Hood's turbines are somewhat different from modern turbines. If you're talking about like the steam turbine in a modern power plant, that is going to be usually going around with considerably more force and at considerably higher speed than Hood's turbines were. Hood's turbines are going, I think it's about 1100 RPM for the low pressure ones and about 1500 RPM for the high pressure ones, which, I mean, that's pretty darn quick, but anyone who's worked with modern steam turbines will know that it's not massively fast. And there's a lot of unknowns here, because where exactly did this failure take place? Was it in the high pressure turbine? Was it in the low pressure turbine? And whereabouts in the turbine did it take place? So if you go and look at HMS Belfast's engine room, for example, they've actually got the turbine casings up so you can see the various rotors sections, and you can see that as you progress through a turbine, the number and size of the turbine blades changes quite considerably. And stripping of turbines wasn't actually really that unknown in the first half of the 20th century. And it usually wasn't actually considered to be a massive immediate problem. It could be something of a problem because if you got a really bad turbine strip, you could end up with a ship that was only able to go about half of its maximum speed. Now, obviously, that is a fairly major mechanical casualty for a ship, especially a warship. However, that seems to be largely, for the most part, the extent of the worst of the damage for most turbine strips of that period. And turbine stripping of that period was essentially classified as anything that damages or otherwise impairs the operation of the rotor blades within a turbine. So, technically speaking, you could lose one blade off a turbine rotor, and obviously, well, that blade going back through the rest of the turbine may cause further damage, but let's assume that that blade gets flung off and, I don't know, wedges itself between rotor 1 and rotor 2, and somehow doesn't cause any further damage. That first rotor will now be destabilized, there'll be an audible noise, and you'll have to do something fairly quickly. But it's not massively critical to the overall efficacy of the ship, especially if it's in the low pressure turbine. And quite often when you look at engineering manuals and engineering reports at the time, when this kind of thing happens, or even if you get multiple blades stripped off and sometimes even multiple rotors damaged, a lot of the approach either seems to be, depending on how the rotor is constructed, either take out the offending blades and put new ones in, or if it's not the kind of rotor where you can swap out individual blades, just take the rotor out and carry on. Yes, you will have a less efficient turbine, but that turbine will still generate a reasonable amount of power. You just have to make do with reduced speed unless and until you can find a replacement rotor. So because we don't know quite what the extent of the damage to Hood's turbine was, or which turbine it occurred in, or where in which turbine it occurred in, how they could repair and replace it, it could quite simply be as simple as rocking up back to Gibraltar and going, hey, we need to unbolt the casing of this turbine, pop it off. Oh, right, yeah, that rotor's a bit stuffed. Right, lift out, make sure there's no fragments in. Great, everyone got the replacement rotor? Cool, in go replacement rotor. Obviously, this is a very short summary. It's still a fairly precision operation, but, replacement rotor in. Does it spin? Great. Is it spinning properly? Great. Put casing back on. Fire it all up. Test. Okay, we're back in business. It could be that simple. I mean, obviously, the other end of things is, something in the high pressure turbine goes and the entire rotor disintegrates and takes out all the other rotors, and the whole turbine just goes completely crazy. But clearly that didn't happen, because otherwise Hood would have been sidelined for ages and only able to crawl around. Noah Androulis asks, why did US Navy cruisers not use torpedoes in the interwar period and in World War II? Well, the US Navy starts out with torpedoes on its cruisers. So the Omaha class carry torpedo launchers. So do the Pensacola's, the Northamptons. And as designed, the Portlands were supposed to have torpedo launchers as well. So basically all of the US heavy cruisers that use the sort of long box turret, like you see here with the Houston. The New Orleans class are the first US heavy cruisers to be designed, well, the first US cruisers to be designed from the get-go without torpedoes, and obviously not carry them. The Portlands were designed with them, but never actually fitted with them. The Northamptons and the Portlands lost theirs in the mid-30s. Obviously, the Atlantas would go on to actually have some. But the overall reasons why the US Navy abandons the idea of torpedoes on its cruisers during the later part of the interwar period in World War II, there's several. Firstly, you've got attempted compliance with treaty restrictions, because torpedoes and their launchers, they do take up weight and space. So as you're needing more and more anti-aircraft armament, and as you're trying to bring in other things as well, deleting the torpedoes saves up a bit of space which you can put towards other things that you might think are more relevant. On top of that, you've got to look at the evolving nature of cruisers in the US Navy battle line. By the early to mid-1930s, the US Navy is envisaging, if you look at the fleet problems, its cruisers being part of a scouting force and carrier escort. Now, if you are a carrier escort and you are launching surface torpedoes at something, something has clearly gone horribly, horribly wrong, and you'd probably be better off saving that weight and using it for something else, because if you use it for something else, you might then avoid the horribly wrong situation, especially if you're doing carrier escort. You probably want a lot more anti-aircraft guns. And if you're the scouting, part of the true scouting force, going forward and looking for the enemy and obviously presumably either following up on or doing the job instead of aircraft, if you're going to engage anybody in a gunfight at all, it's going to be at long range. If you're engaging them at long range for 8-inch guns, then, well, you're not going to be close enough to launch torpedoes anyway, and therefore, again, it's better off not to have them, because it will allow you to save weight that can be put into other things that will facilitate your objectives considerably better, like slightly more speed or slightly more long-range gunfire power. There is a small chance, of course, that you might run into some big capital ship up close, at which point torpedoes would be very, very useful, but at that point the US Navy concluded, one, well, at that point nothing's probably likely to save you, so yeah, it's not going to help. And also, if you are at very close range to an enemy capital ship, like sub 10,000 yards, then, well, your 8-inch guns will probably be of a lot more use to you than torpedoes are ever going to be, because at that kind of range, you can actually penetrate the armor of a lot of Japanese capital ships. So, again, no real point in having the torpedoes. And on top of that, there were, concerns about, well, a torpedo before it's launched is a big, long stick full of highly volatile fuel and potentially some explosives, at which point you've got enough problems with a bunch of aircraft stuck amidships. You don't necessarily want to also have torpedoes there, because if you get hit, and bear in mind under the doctrine, the way the US Navy is thinking about using its cruisers, there's not going to be many circumstances where they're going to get to launch their torpedoes, so the torpedoes are probably going to be there when the launchers are hit. It just seems like an unnecessary explosion and fire risk for something that you're, under US interwar fleet doctrine, probably never going to use. Whereas other navies that did maintain torpedo launchers on their cruisers, they tend to have slightly different doctrines about how they're operating their cruisers, at which point in their doctrines they're more likely to end up in situations where you might want to use a torpedo considerably more often. Red Ranger asks, in an age of sail battle, at what point can a captured warship be put to use? Somehow I'm having a hard time picturing the former and surviving crew being all that happy about suddenly changing sides. It very much depends on the precise circumstances. So one of the easiest ways to put a captured warship to use in an age of sail battle is if the crew decide that they are going to cooperate with you. Now, obviously, that is a relatively rare circumstance, but it's not unknown. So in the Battle of Trafalgar video that I did a while back, I actually pointed out that because of what were perceived as the dishonourable actions of the French vanguard, at least one Spanish warship had its crew get so incensed with the French that the crew actually volunteered to serve under the British officers who had captured their ship and to actually open fire on their erstwhile allies. As it happened, the French vanguard, or the relevant ships in the French vanguard, sailed out of gun range before they could get themselves together and marshal a broadside, but they were perfectly willing to do so. Now, that is a bit of an edge case, admittedly. So normally, a captured warship would only really ever be able to be put to use once you've taken it home, disembarked the former crew, and recommissioned it. However, there are some circumstances where you may be able to put a captured warship to use in the same engagement. Now, it's going to be relatively unlikely and relatively rare because, apart from anything, if you've managed to force a ship to surrender, chances are you've probably battered it, quite badly. So it may not be an operational warship at that stage, but you could think of a theoretical scenario where this might be the case. So if, say, the ship is somewhat undermanned, and therefore you can confine what's left of the crew to either the hold or maybe the hold on the lower gun deck if the ship has multiple gun decks, then you could, in theory, sail the ship and operate the upper guns or all the guns. But also, more prosaically, what is the overall size discrepancy between the ship that's doing the capturing and the ship that's being captured? Because if you've got a slightly overcrewed, fresh out of dockyard, first-rate ship of the line, and it's wandered up to a 64 gunner or a 54 gunner or something like that, and put a broadside or two out there for the purposes of honour, and the smaller fourth rate or small third rate has just gone, nope, no, we're fine, we acknowledge, we give up, please don't shoot us anymore, then you've got a relatively intact ship, and you may be able to, if you like, minimally man it for action just with your prize crews or prize crew. And then you could then get the ship back into action within a matter of, 15 minutes, half an hour, if you're really lucky, again, by confining the surviving enemy crew to the cargo hold, or perhaps cargo hold and lower gun deck. And of course, if the discrepancy gets even greater, so again, use our overstuffed first rate as an example, if you've run down and captured an enemy frigate in the middle of a storm, for example, your available prize crew may very well approach the size of the total crew of that frigate, at which point you might keep some on board again in the hold as prisoners, bring some others on board your ship to be prisoners, and then you've essentially got, as long as somebody keeps a guard on those lower hold levels, you probably can pretty much man that frigate and get it back into action again relatively quickly, because there's a certain amount of interoperability in Age of Sail warships. Paul Frederick asks, Drac, you frequently mentioned the vertical triple expansion engines used on pre-dreadnoughts and some early dreadnoughts couldn't maintain high speed for extended periods. However, many of the big Atlantic passenger liners had triple expansion engines, and they maintained high speed for 4 to 5 days straight during a crossing, and were pushing their maximum speed, especially when they were trying for the blue ribbon. Why could they do it, but not warships? Well, the simple answer is that most of the ships doing the blue ribbon run weren't actually pushing their max speed. They were pushing for a maximum sustained speed, but specifically because of the issues with running a vertical triple expansion engine right up at the limit, they weren't doing so. So even on blue ribbon runs, if you compare the theoretical total output of a ocean liner that's making the run versus its day-to-day power output, they're usually running at 70 to 80% of total power output, which is a speed that can relatively reliably be run on vertical triple expansion engines for a long period of time. I mean, also their engine rooms tend to be considerably larger, so you can swarm them with crew in a way that the somewhat more cramped environment of a warship is a little bit harder to do when the engines are running, but mostly it's down to the fact that they're essentially running at a, relatively speaking, sustainable power output. And it doesn't help that sometimes ships' maximum speed, especially when it comes to blue ribboned holders, is quoted as people essentially taking the distance that they travelled over the time that they took to travel it during their blue ribboned run and going, oh, well, that's clearly at top speed. And it's like, no, that's the average speed, because remember, during that time the ship is going to be at times going considerably slower, and therefore to reach an average speed at times it's also going to be going considerably faster. And you see this even when you get into turbine-powered ships like Mauritania here and Lusitania, which held the blue ribbon several times. If you look at what Lusitania and Mauritania were actually capable of, admittedly they're turbine ships, but the principle still holds in terms of power management. If you look at what they were capable of on trials, they could hit 26.5 knots. Their average speed over blue ribbon runs is only 24-ish, because, again, they're not running on full power. And that's for several reasons. Partly it's to avoid expensive wear and tear and damage to the engines. Partly it's for passenger comfort, because when you push power plants to within an inch of their lives, the whole ship tends to vibrate, which, for a warship in a desperate chase of the enemy or desperate trying to get away from an enemy, people will quite happily put up with. If you're a first-class passenger trying to have your team, not so much. And also, because it is more of an endurance marathon than a sprint, if ultimately you're running at, say, 70-80% of power output and something goes wrong with a boiler, you can switch over to another boiler and keep your speed up, rather than if you're running on everything and once something breaks, well, then you are going to start slowing down rather quickly. And thus we reach the end of Drydock episode 416. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.